There's an interesting report that was just put out by Wisconsin Institute in Law and Liberty talking about this weakness that has emerged on the right. And the weakness on the right, which typically you could argue sort of broadly stems from economic pain, is providing an opening for the left to promote ideologies that are just fundamentally antithetical to freedom and free markets, real free markets, things like price controls, et cetera. But the economic pain that everybody's experiencing isn't being alleviated. And so what to do? So we'll use two examples because the report used two examples, prescription drugs and energy. Will Flanders, who's part of putting this report together, joins me on the program. Will, if you look at prescription drugs and energy, you can pick either one of these. What you see is a rigged game, okay? And everybody sees the rigged game. Everyone sees that prescription drugs and their costs are being rigged, whether by PBMs, whether they understand the granular details of it or not. It doesn't make sense to them. They're angry about it. No one's doing anything to stop it. Same thing with energy. When you see energy costs continually going up, even though you have sealed your home, bought the new HVAC system, swapped out all your light bulbs, it's a rigged game and people notice that. And because no one's doing anything about it, when I say no one, I mean people from the right are doing absolutely nothing about it. It provides an opening for the left to say, you know what we really need? Prescription drug price controls. You know what we really need? We need fixed energy price controls. And until I think the right responds with something that looks like action, we actually may slide into democratic socialism without even realizing we're going there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So what we wanted to do with this new polling that we've just released is to take a look at the populist-leaning wing of the Republican Party. We know that in the Trump era, that's become a pretty substantial, share of voters that are more populist-aligned, more MAGA-aligned, and see what they think about a number of issues. And you touched on, prescription drugs and energy prices. One of the questions we asked in this poll was, how much control do you think the federal government should have on these issues? And while there are a couple of things that we think are pretty good, a majority of folks in this wing of the party say that government should not have control of individual wealth or net worth. Once you get to things like drug prices, once you get to things like corporate profits or credit card interest, then we drop below 50%, where the majority of folks are saying that the government should have some level of control. And a decent percentage, over 25% in all these cases, are saying there should be a high level of control. And I think you're right. It's essentially that there's a vacuum that's being filled with socialism. You have to remember, if we go back to 2012, there is a share of the Trump vote that actually were Obama voters. It's hard to believe, but there were some folks that are looking for someone who's promising to get something done. And conservatives haven't always been offering great alternatives on those topics, particularly.
No, conservatives have offered, not individual conservatives notwithstanding, Ron Johnson notwithstanding, for instance, have offered nothing. That's the problem. This is why Trump rose to, in the first place, because in the face of exploding prescription drug prices, the answer was nothing. When they had a chance to repeal Obamacare, which was part of this problem, now let's just go from prescription drug prices to health insurance, the Republicans didn't repeal the law. They did nothing, right? You look at energy, when Barack Obama said you can charge ratepayers for projects not actually generating energy, meaning you could build solar arrays, you could build wind farms, and you could charge ratepayers for that, and rates started to explode. What did the Republicans do? Nothing. And see, that's where the opening is. When populism broadly is a distrust of elite institutions, right? That's broadly what it is. I'm kind of there myself.
Yep.
But when the people, who are in charge of the elite institutions that are supposed to resist progressivism, socialism, do nothing, is it any wonder that we find ourselves in 2026 with a whole bunch of people saying, screw it, let's just do price controls?
No, there was something with Obamacare particularly. There was like a dog that caught the car mentality, right? You don't know what to do now. We didn't actually expect to be in a position to get rid of this law, and there was seemingly no workable plan, certainly. And that's the case across a lot of issues. And I think what you see here again is that, these voters distrust institutions for a reason. It's not just because they're not following the news, and they're deeply following the news, and every day confirms more and more that the people in charge of the institutions either don't care or just don't have an answer.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing in this polling.
And what you also see is that there's a really simple solution, and that is accountability. And get rid of the corruption, stop taking the money under the table from the lobbyist. And that's almost too much of an ask. It's not hard, physically not hard, logistically not hard, but it's politically the hardest thing on earth. And so, I think folks sort of innately understand that, and that simply swapping out bodies is not going to be the answer. So, I'm not sure what the answer is unless we can solve the lust for greed and corruption in the heart of men.
Yeah, it's sort of the problem of all of history, right? But I do think you're right when you touched on accountability and transparency. There are very few things, even among a subset of voters, that you can poll where you'll get over 90% support. But we had over 90% support for more audits in government. That goes for things like elections, but also just sunshine in general across all of government. People want to see behind the scenes and know what's going on. That's a way you can, one, rebuild trust in institutions, which is a, sort of law and policy center. That's something in general we're in favor of. But it's also a way to show people that you're action oriented and you're actually moving towards achieving some of the things that they care about the most. Is let people see what's actually happening behind the curtain rather than obfuscating and doing everything you can to hide the process.
Yeah, and again, this poll suggests that we don't have to go down the road to socialism, but there's an enormous amount of frustration on the right side of the ledger here, on the right side of the political ledger. There's a huge amount of frustration, and so I think there's room for government. But here's what the way I think about it, and I was reminded again when Dan Knodel, Representative Knodel, and you're going to be hearing from him on the show, announced plans to reintroduce the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Wisconsin, which is an artificial mechanism that does not permit the government to go beyond a certain level of spending. It is a hard, artificial rule, unbreakable rule that says the government can't go beyond X. And it's those kinds of things that it seems to me could be very, very helpful here. Forced transparency. Don't rely on, an executive or some, unelected bunch of bureaucrats to generate some report that isn't actionable. You can create mechanisms in the law that say, if the audit shows X, the legislature must do Y. And I think that can restore trust. So those are the kinds of government interventions that make sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're common sense, right? They're things that the average person can understand. We have a household budget. Why isn't the government held to a budget themselves? Things like zero-based budgeting, another thing that's intuitive. Correct. They may take a little bit more explanation. They get a little bit beyond, what people think of emotionally sometimes, but they are intuitive. They make sense from your own family's perspective, and they actually would be effective at achieving those overall goals.
We need someone to go first, it seems. So DeSantis, was a great model. I don't know why no one's using DeSantis as a model, because what's been going on in Florida has been pretty extraordinary in terms of these government interventions that aren't saying, we're going to pay for your prescription drugs. It's we're going to back these regulations off, or we're going to back these lobbyists off, or we're going to re-empower the people. Because again, broadly, populism is supposedly, we the people have more, there's more trust in we the people than there is in these elite institutions. And Florida's shown kind of a nice narrow pathway on how to walk it and not go too far in one direction or another. And so we just need I think we need someone to go first on zero-based budgeting. What do we have a governor? Do we have a state that has decided to do that? I mean, Florida's going to show the way on property taxes. Imagine if we said you're no longer allowed as a utility to charge people for projects. You must generate electricity in order to generate a rate. All these things are pretty simple and could be done at the state level.
Yeah, and I think, when you talk to legislators, right, they always want to see, they want the safety of knowing someone else has done it. I think you're right on some of those issues. Florida is a great model. There's regulatory reforms where states like Utah can serve as a great model. So there are states out there that we can look to. And someone has to go first in Wisconsin, but on a lot of these things, we don't necessarily have to go first across the country, because those states have shown the way. with these common sense reforms that can be messaged pretty effectively and pretty clearly, and also, again, get the job done and actually achieving some of the goals we want and more transparency and more accountability.
Right. And by the way, more, just having an economy that isn't schizophrenic, having, the important parts of our economy not insane, like healthcare, like housing, like energy. These are very important things. You need food. You need all of these things. The answer to restoring affordability is getting rid of the layer upon layer of regulation that only feed the corrupt hand of, corporate lobbyists. That's not that hard. I think if you reset Wisconsin, for instance, like Florida's doing, if you reset Wisconsin like Scott Walker had done, and he didn't have to do all of these other reforms because it wasn't clear that we were having problems with it, for business, for success, for, increased paychecks, people tend to just sort of, go about their business and have a nice time, and they don't get so frustrated.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you got to explain these things in a way that isn't getting into what I like to, which is like, Milton Friedman, suggests this would work, right? What you have to do instead is explain it to people on the basis of their own pocketbook and how this will affect small businesses in their area, how this will affect their ability to afford, groceries and childcare, and get rid of sort of the, Milton Friedman economic theory stuff that at least folks like me sometimes sort of go back towards, and put it onto the terms that not necessarily that folks can understand, but actually are more relevant to them in their everyday life, for sure.
You don't have to drag, you don't have to drag people into, your 30-page blog post on Hayek. You can just simply say, we think this doesn't make sense. It obviously is corrupt. And we're going to stop it. And by the way, the Tiffany campaign can do that right now. They can do that right now. You can say, we are no longer going to allow ratepayers to be charged for stranded assets. We're no longer going to allow ratepayers to be charged for, shutting down perfectly good coal plants and putting up solar facilities. You're not going to be charged for that anymore. If they want to do it and, there's agreements, go crazy, but ratepayers aren't going to foot the freight for this stuff anymore. Wisconsin can do this on its own. And even with the federal rules, and so you can do this with health insurance. You can say no longer are PBMs going to be allowed to change formularies and jack people's prices and steal people's drug coupons. You can do this in Wisconsin. It's so frustrating. You can roll back housing regulations that increase the cost of housing 20, 40, 30, or 50% from where it was 10 years ago.
And remember, we talk about federal roadblocks. We've never had a better opportunity to get around the federal roadblocks than we have today across Medicaid, across any number of different federal agencies. They're really willing to accept, waivers for creative solutions. We have a, reform-oriented federal government under President Trump. So now is the time, and we can't use the federal government as an excuse in many instances like we could in other times. That's
true, because they'll let us do it. They will let us do this stuff. This is, way, way back in the day, back when Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty first formed, I think it was, or right around that time. You guys put out a wonderful white paper called Competitive Federalism. And that's really what we're talking about here is states have an enormous amount of authority and freedom to experiment and do things that work and then stop doing the things that don't work. For some reason, we're all acting like you can't repeal something that was awful. I appreciate the time on the program. This is a really interesting survey, but it ought to be a warning shot for the Republicans that sooner or later, people are going to get tired of hearing the rhetoric if it's not matched with action.
Absolutely. We'll hope folks take advantage of it, take a look, and apply it in a number of different contexts, from campaigns to elected office.
Tom, Tiffany, call your office and tell your office to go find this report and download it and study it. We'll take a quick break. Will Flanders, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.